First, let's start with the accesses. Okay, accesses, the getters. The first one I'm going to create is going to be a method to just return to me the employee ID, return the employee IDs. And so I'm going to create a public field. It's going to return, when you think about it, it's going to return an integer array over here. Okay, it's going to return an integer array. So I'm going to set the return type public. Okay, it's also going to be an instance method, no static keyword. Public, the return type is going to be an integer array. It's going to return an integer array, and I'm going to set the name. Okay, I'm going to call it get all employee IDs. Get all employee IDs. And get all employee IDs, when you think about it, it's going to return all the employee IDs, but it's not going to accept any arguments. So I'm not going to define anything here. It's only going to return, employee ID, the array, the field employee ID. That's what it's going to return. Okay, it's going to return that. Okay, so public int get all employee IDs is going to return that. Let's also have accesses for the other array. So I'm going to make a copy of this and paste it. I'm going to have another one for get all hours, right? That's also going to be an integer array. So I'm setting the return type as an integer array. I'll call it get all employee. Let's call it employee hours. And then return hours, the hours array. Okay, let's have another one. Call it, oopsie. Let's call it get all employee pay rate. And so get all employee pay rate, right? And pay rate is a double array. So let's set the return type to a double, public double, a double array. That's a return type, get all employee pay rate. And then we want to return the pay rate array here, pay rate array. And lastly, we want to go ahead and get all the employee wages. Okay, so get all employee wages here, and we're going to return the wages array here. All right, now let's talk about the mutators, the setters. Okay, now we are going to use a loop, right, to ask the user to type in their values, and each iteration, the user is going to store a value in the hours and pay rate array. Okay, we're going to do that. We're going to create a loop to set a slot or a particular slot in an array. And so, okay, we're going to use a loop to basically set the value, set the hours, set the pay rate, and then we'll move on to the next employee, set the hours and set the pay rate. And so let's create a setter or a mutator that's going to, a method that's going to basically set one particular slot in an array. So I'm going to create a public. Well, let's just indent it as well. All right, so create a public method, also an instance method, no static keyword. All it's going to do here is going to set something. It's not really going to return anything. And so I'm going to set a return type to void, meaning it's not going to return anything. So public void, I'm going to call it set employee hours. Okay, it's just one particular value I'm setting. Okay, one particular value in one particular index, and so it's going to need that hour. Okay, so I'll define the employee hours. We know the employee hours stores integers, right? So I'm going to say, if you want me to set the employee hours, then give me the integer employee hour. And so I'm setting a parameter for employee hour. Actually, I'll say employee hours. And then I'll need the index to store it in. And so I'm defining another parameter for employee index. So it will need the employee hours and it will need the employee index to store it in. And what I want to do is over here, I need, since I'm setting the hours, but what I'm doing is in the hours array, I am setting in the hours array here, in this particular index, which is the employee index that's going to be given to me, I'm setting in that slot the hours, which is going to be the value that was given to me here, the employee hours. Actually, let's call this employee hours given, and let's call this employee index given, so we can see the difference. So in this particular index given of the employee array, so start here, index given, I'm storing, sorry, In this particular index given of the hours array, I'm storing the employee hours that was given by the user in it. Okay, so we are storing one thing here. When this method is called, we are only storing one thing in that array. But in the main, we'll write a loop that's going to use this method multiple times to set hours. Okay, set the hours multiple times. And so by the time the loop is done, we'll have the hours array filled. Let's do the same thing for payRate. So let's call it set employee payRate. And payRate is going to need an employee payRate given. Sorry. Employee payRate given, I'll call it employee payRate. And it's going to need an employee index, the same index. Where should you store the employee payRate in the employee array? So in the payRate array. So I'm going to use a payRate array here. In this particular employee index given, I want to store the not the hours given, but then the payRate given, employee payRate given. Okay, and so I think that the class is taking shape. I think we have everything we need. If we need anything else, we'll come back to it. But I think it looks good for now. Sorry. Yes, sorry. Sorry. I don't know where, that's coming from. Sorry. Okay, and so I mentioned we're going to create two files. The first one is going to have the class, which is this one, and the second one is going to be a program that's going to test this class. And as long as those two files are in the same location, the same folder, they should be able to see each other and work with each other. If not, you'd have to specify to the program that's going to test the class. Sorry, you'd have to. If you don't have the two files, the class and the program that's going to test the class in the same folder, you'd have to specify to the program that's going to test the class. You'd have to specify to it the path of the class, of the path to where the class is, so that they can have access to each other. But in my case, I'm going to save it in the same location. All right, so let's compile this. And yes, always save. All right, let's compile this, and I'm going to go to my desktop. And in Java Programming Challenges, I'll create chapter 7. And so I had a test program for this one, which is Payroll Class. So I'm going to create another folder for it, for a new one, and then I'll modify it later on. I was testing some values over here, and so this is going to be I'll call it Payroll 2 for now, but then later I'll delete this one because this is not even complete. This was just to test a few things out. All right, so I'm going to call it Payroll Class 2, right? This is just the folder itself, just so it doesn't conflict with the first one. All right, and then I'll save this here as payroll.java, and so we compiled with it without errors, which is good. All right, and so I'll this is done compiling. So I'll create a new file, and that's going to be the program itself. And so let me make a copy of the class, like the question, so I can paste it on a new page, so you don't go back and forth looking at the question. All right, so I'll create the class for this one, and I'll call this payroll test. All right, and then I'll go ahead and create the main method. So public static void main. All right, so let's see. Oh, well, let me fill this up. All right, so let's see. Okay, so it says demonstrate the class in so when I was reading this question for the first time and I was trying to figure it out, I was figuring out how we're going to do this, because it didn't really tell us, even for the class, right? It didn't really tell us which methods we should create. It said appropriate access and mutator methods. So when I was testing it out, I created some of these. Well, I had an idea of it, but I just wanted to test it out to see how it looks. So I had something similar, not all this though. I just had the main, this and that, when I was testing it in my the program that I did, but not everything. But this should work. With the idea that I had in mind, it should work based on the class that I created. So we should be able to come up with a main that works with it well. We'll figure it out. Okay. All right. So Demonstrate the class in the program that displays each employee number and asks the user to enter the employee's hours and periods. All right, so we are going to display each employee number, right? We're going to do that and ask the user to do that. All right, so let's use a loop, right? We're going to use a loop to basically go through this employee. Well, actually, the loop that we create can go through any of the arrays. We know that we know that we can go through any of the arrays, right? And before any of those, actually, let's first create an object from the payroll class, because we may end up, I may end up using it, and it's good if we have it, so you don't get confused. So let's create an object from this class. So I'm going to create a payroll object. I'm going to call it employee info. Okay, so when you do this, it's just like creating something like integer number, right? Integer is a type and number is the name of the variable. You can think of the payroll as a type, and you can think of the employee info as the variable. The only difference is when you try to do something like this, Java is going to realize that this payroll is not one of the primitive data types. It's not an integer, it's not a double, it's not a character. Java is going to know that and say, okay, you are trying to create a variable that's going to store an object of this type, and so it's going to look in your folder to see if it can find a payroll class, and in my case it's going to find it, right, and say, okay, because you have the payroll class there, I'm going to reserve this variable to hold a payroll object. It's not holding the object yet, but it's going to hold a payroll object. If you don't have your class in the same folder, like I said, make sure you specify the path to this main program, okay, of where your class is. All right. And so now I have a variable that's going to hold a payroll object. So all I need to do is now create a new payroll object in memory, and that's it. In our constructor, we define it in such a way that this is our constructor. This is our constructor. We define it in such a way that you don't need any arguments when you create a constructor. And so you create a constructor, and then this employee info will be an object that's going to have its employee ID initialized, and the hours, periods, and wages will have their sizes set up, or their size set up. All right. And so what I want to do is we're going to go through the array. We're going to set up a loop that can go through any of the arrays. Basically, all the arrays have 7 elements. So set up a loop that can go through any of the arrays. And then and then once we do that, we're going to actually go through the employee ID array and then display the employee IDs one after the other, and tell the user to type in the hours. Tell this employee to type in the hours, and then we'll store the hours in the hours array, and then we'll store the periods in the pay rate array. We'll ask them first, and that's all it's going to do. And so I'm going to instead of doing it in main directly, let's create a method. Let's create a regular public static method, right, or a static method. Let's do that here in main. So I'm going to so basically this method, the idea of it is to assign the wages and fill the hours and periods array. And so I'm going to create a public static method. It's not really going to return anything. All it's doing is it's basically filling the hours array and filling the period array. And so it's not really going to return anything. And so I'm going to set the return type to void. Void means it returns nothing. The public static void, I'll call this method assign hours. It's going to be a long name. Feel free to make yours short. Assign employee hours and pay rate. Okay, so yeah, that's all. So yeah, if this is a long name, just feel free to make yours short. If you know me by now, you'd get used to the fact that I like long names. Yeah. If not, you get used to it. All right. And so I'm going to call this assign employee hours and pay rates. And what do I want, or what do I need for this argument? So or for this method when someone tries to call it. Well, we have an employee info here, right? And that with the employee info, we can actually, it has a couple of methods whether we can use. So let's pass in, because we're going to need the arrays, we're going to need access to these arrays so we can actually directly fill it. Okay, directly put in values. And so you can actually define this assign employee hours and pay rates to accept in the hours array and the pay rates array. You can do that, right? But then if we have the object, then we can use the object to we can have access directly. Okay, we can have access to these arrays through the public methods here. To get all employee wages, we can have access to them. We can set values in these arrays, the hours array and the pay rates array. We can do that. So it's better to pass in the object. And so I'm going to define this method to accept in as an argument an object, and the object is going to be a payroll object. Okay, and I'll call the object, it's just a parameter name, so I'll set the parameter name and call it payroll object. And so this method, when called, will accept in a payroll object. Okay, you have to pass in a payroll object. How are we going to use the payroll object? What we want to do is, first of all, we are going to ask the user to type in something, right? And we have to use one of Java's features for accepting user input, either the scanner or the job option pane. I'm going to use a scanner for this one. I'm just choosing to use a scanner for this one. Although I can use a job option pane, I'm choosing to use a scanner for this one. And so before we can use a scanner, we need to import it, right? So I'm importing the scanner class. Okay, so I'm importing java.util.scanner. So all I'm doing here is I'm importing the scanner class located in the java.util package in the Java API. Okay, and so now once I have a scanner, once I've imported the scanner class, I need to go ahead and create a scanner object so I can use it to accept input from the from the user. And so I'm going to create a scanner object. I'm going to call it keyboard, because keyboard is really what it is. The source of input is from the keyboard. So I'm now creating a new scanner object in memory. I'm going to pass in system.in, which refers to the keyboard, and this is the source of input. The source of input is a keyboard. System.in is a keyboard, and keyboard over here just refers to my scanner. Okay. All right, sorry about all the coughing and all the clearing my throat and all that stuff. I don't know what's happening. Okay. All right, so now we have a scanner object to use. And so what we should do first of all is display the first item in the employee ID array, employee ID array, right? And so let's use a regular system.out.println and ask the user to please. Actually, since we're going to be asking the user multiple times, right, we're going to have a loop. We should have a loop rather to go through the array so that each time it iterates, it moves to the next element. And so basically we're going to display the first element in the employee ID array, move to the next element. We want to do that dynamically, so let's use a loop. And so we can use a for loop to go through. We create one similar to the one we created in the class to go through any of the arrays. Okay, it's going to go through it, basically 7 times, starting from the first element. All right. And so I'm going to create a for loop here. And again, it's going to be very similar to the one we had. I'm going to set an integer employee index that's going to refer to our index. So for employee index is equal to 0. Now, as long as the employee index, now the employee index has to be less than the length of the array for it to be a valid index, for it to be used to access an element in the array, for it to be like a valid index in the array. And so over here, we said that as long as the employee index is less than the number of employees, right? We don't have access to number of employees here. We don't have anywhere that stores the number of employees. Over here, we had it stored over here up here, number of employees, so we could use it. But we don't have it anywhere here in main, right? So as long as it's less than what? And so we have the object here. And so let's start with the object. Let's start with it. So as long as it's less than the payroll object, whatever object that's passed in, it's basically represented by payroll object. So as long as it's less than the payroll object, but this is not complete. We have the object here, and we have a method here that gets all the employee IDs right here. Get all employee IDs returns the employee ID array. It returns that array. And so when I call payroll object.get all employee IDs, this statement here, this whole statement here returns the array, right? It returns the array. But we know that every array, right, has a public field called length, right? We have every array, like we know, like over here, the way we use employee ID.length, we know that every array has a public field called length, and the whole statement returns the array, the full array, right? And so the way we access that public field, we can say, well, first of all, we know get employee IDs is a method, so we need to have our parentheses here, right? And so this whole thing returns the array, and so we can say the whole array, right, dot length, which is going to return the length of that array. And so this whole statement is returning the length of the employee ID array. And so it's the same thing as this. It's still going to have this whole statement is going to basically return, or basically have it's going to be equal to the length of the employee ID array. Okay, so as long as the employee index is less than the length of the employee ID array, that's basically what this is doing. All right, employee gets all employee IDs, returns the array, and then the length returns the length of it. So it's the same thing as 7, or basically whatever is stored in here. Okay, the length of it. How many items are stored in there? Oops, what did I do? All right, compile this. All right, save this. All right. And so this is going to return the length. All right. So as long as it's less than the length of it, then it's a valid index. And so as long as it's less than the length of it, then do what's in the loop, and before you come back up and check to see if the employee index is less than the length of the employee ID array, then add 1 to employee index. Before you come back and check to see if the employee index is less than the length of the employee ID array, then add 1 to it, add 1 to the employee index. Okay. All right. So it's just like the same loop. The only thing is we are using different ways to access the number of employees or the number of items stored in the array. It's going to be the same number. It's just the way we are two different ways to access it. All right. So each time, right, we want to now display a message and say system.out.println, right? We say please enter the, first of all, it's hours, right? So please enter the hours for employee. Now I want to use, I'm going to concatenate it here with something, but I want to use the employee ID itself. So the first time I wanted to say, please enter the hours for employee 5658845. The second time I wanted to say, please enter the hours for employee 4520125. And so how do I access the element in the employee ID array? Well, we don't have it anywhere here, but we still have the object. We have the object. Right? So let's start with the object. And so payroll object here. Again, we know that the payroll object has a method here that returns the array, the employee ID array. We know this get all employee IDs returns it. So just like this, we know it does return it. So when I call payroll object dot get all employee IDs, right, we know this whole thing returns the array. But how do I refer to the particular slot? How do I refer to this particular slot? We know we refer to these slots by the indices, or the particular index. And employee index is keeping track of that for us. So the very first time employee index is 0. So the very second time employee index is 1, 2, 3, all the way to the last index, which is going to be 1 less than the length of the array, right? This is what we're doing here, making sure that the index is always less than the length of the array. That's what we're doing here. And so we know this whole statement here is this one here is returning the array, the employee ID array, because get all employee IDs returns the array. And if we have the array, the way we access each element in the array is using the square bracket. And so although it may not look right, look at how it looks. It looks a bit, it looks right. It is right, but it may look a bit weird, right? It works, it's right. This whole statement here returns the array. And so you can think of this as the array itself. and now we are accessing a particular slot using the index, and employee index is keeping track of that what particular index we are on. And so I can say employee index here, because that will be the index, the particular index we are on now. So this statement now will basically display, please enter the hours for employee. It's going to start off with this number and move on to this number, and so on and so forth. All right, so once we do that, now we need to ask the user. We need to allow the user to type in something, right? And so I'm going to use a scanner, which is keyboard here. The scanner I just created over here, keyboard dot next. Okay, this is the hours, so it's an integer. So keyboard dot next. Sorry, did I say next hours? Wow, that doesn't exist. All right, keyboard dot next double. Okay, keyboard dot next double is basically going to pop up some kind of text box and allow the user to type in a value, and whatever value the user types is returned, okay, as a double. And so once it's returned, we need a place to store it, right? So I'm going to come up here and define outside the loop, but in the method, and define a double value, a variable called employee hours. Okay, employee hours, and employee hours over here now is going to store whatever the user types in for the hours, right? And once we have the employee hours, what we want to do is we want to store it in that particular index, that particular employee index of the hours array. Okay, and so we say that the way we access, we don't have the hours array here, but we have the object. So let's start with it. Let's say payroll object. We have the object here. We want to store it in the hours array, that particular index. And so the way we access the hours arrays, we have the object here, and we know that this method over here gets all employee hours, returns the hours array to us. And so we're going to say payroll object dot get all employee hours, right? It's a method here, which this returns. Hold on 1 second. Oops, I made a mistake here. All right, so we don't need to actually get the array. We need to actually set in a value. We need to set in a value. And so we don't need to get the array, we just need to directly set the value. And so this is wrong. The statement I had before, this one here, I undo. Okay, so that's wrong. I'm going to redo. Take it back. Sorry. Yeah, we don't need to get to that array. We need to set it. We have a value in employee hours, and once we have it, let's set it. And actually, I was referring to that. We have a method over here, set employee hours, which takes in the value and the index you want to store it in, and sets the hours array, the value at that particular index that you provided. You provide as argument. And so once we have the employee types in the hours over here, let's set, right? We have there's no way to set the hours because we don't have the hours array here. So we have the object, so payroll object, but we have the method that can set a value in the hours array. When we give it the hours and we give it an index, it's called set employee hours, right? So I'm going to copy it, and payroll object dot set employee hours. Payroll object dot set employee hours is going to need, the way we defined it, is going to need the employee hours given, which is the hours that we have to provide, and then the index. And so the hours we're going to provide is already here as employee hours. Sorry, it's going to be here as employee hours, and so I'm going to basically pass in the employee hours here as an argument, and I also need to pass in the index that it should store this employee hours at. I'm so sorry, I don't know where this is coming from again. All right, so we pass in the employee hours to this method, and we need to tell it where it should store this hour, or this employee hours. And so that's going to be that particular employee index that we are on right here. Okay, and so we are going to use the employee index to refer to that particular index we are on. Set the value that we provide here to that particular index. Then we're done with filling that particular slot, this particular index. Okay, fill it with this particular hour that the person typed in for this particular employee. And employee index is keeping track of each particular ID, each particular employee. Okay, now after we are done asking the user to type in the hours for that particular employee, before we move on to the next employee, let's also ask for that particular, pay rate for that particular employee. And so let's say please enter the pay rate for employee, or let's just change the message a little bit. So what's the pay rate for employee? We're still going to use this payroll object to get employee IDs, that particular index, right? We're still going to use this to display that particular employee ID. Same thing as this. We're going to use this to display that particular employee's ID. And then this time around, we will have, this is just a message to get the pay rate. They're just going to type in the pay rate. Actually, this is wrong, because it just came to mind. The employee's hours, right, is going to be not a double, but an integer. Let's see how I define it here. I'm sorry. And so calculate wages. So I define it as an integer. Set hours. Let's see. Set employee hours. It takes in an int. Okay. All right. So it's fine. But over here, we need an integer to store in the employee. So we need an integer to store in the hours array, because the hours array is defined to only store integers. And so instead of using next double, let's use next int. And next int is similar to next double. It's going to pop up a text box and allow the user to type in something. And whatever the user types is going to be returned as an integer. And so it's going to be stored in employee hours. That means employee hours has to be defined as an integer too. So define an integer variable called employee hours. Store an integer in the employee hours and store it in the hours array here. Okay, we defined that method to also accept in an integer. Set hours, it's accepting an integer. Okay, so we are fine. Now we ask for the pay rate, right? It's going to need, well, this time around, let's call next double, right? Because next double is going to allow the user to type in a double. That value is going to be returned as a double. Okay, it's going to basically pop up a text box and allow the user to type in something. Whatever the user types is going to be, try to be converted to a double, and it's going to be returned as a double. And so we need a variable to store that, right? So let's create a double variable, call it pay rate, and let's call it employee pay rate. And then employee pay rate is going to hold what pay rate the user types in for that particular employee. And once we have the pay rate, okay, that's a double, we know the object, okay, this class, the object that was created from this class has a method that says set employee pay rate. It accepts in, okay, so we needed to fix this too. It accepts in an employee pay rate given, but it has to be a double though, because the employee pay rate is a double array, and so it needs a double employee pay rate given. So change this to a double, and it's going to need an integer index. Okay, the index that is just stored as double employee pay rate. Okay, and so in the pay rate in this particular index, we're storing this employee pay rate. All right, and so over here we'll have an employee pay rate double, but then this is going to be set employee's pay rate, because I just copied it, so I need to change it. So set employee pay rate is this method here. It's going to accept in an employee pay rate given, which is going to be the pay rate that employee typed here. So it's going to accept in the employee pay rate, and it's going to accept in an index where it should store that employee pay rate given. And the index is going to be basically that particular employee index that we are using to keep track of what particular index we are on, or what particular element we are on. Okay. The index keeps track of basically what particular index we are on, what slot we are on right now. So by the time this is done, this loop is done, we will basically have both arrays failed, both the employee hours and then employee pay rate failed. So we are done with assign employee hours and pay rate. That's what the method is going to do. All right, so we have our object in main. Okay. The next thing we want to do is we would want to assign the employee hours and pay rate, right? So let's go ahead and call this method. Let's call it assign. Let's make a copy of it. We want to call it assign employee hours and pay rate. But we define assign employee hours and pay rate to accept in the payroll object, which we have defined here as employee info. So I'm going to copy it and paste it. So assign employee hours and pay rates using employee info, or you can think of it as in the employee info. That's how it reads, right? But really we are using the object. You're assigning the employee hours and pay rates. We're actually filling those arrays, the hours and pay rates, and the user is going to basically type in all those values. All right. The next thing we want to do is we want to calculate, right? We want to calculate the wages, and remember the wages use what's stored in the hours array and the pay rates array, and use the values there to calculate the wages. So basically, the wages is all what it's doing is it's filling the wages array with values. And so we have a method in the class called calculate wages, which does that. It uses the value stored in hours and pay rates, because at this point, once the employee hours and pay rates have been assigned, the hours and pay rates array will be filled. And so all we need to do is call the calculate wages method, and it's going to calculate the wages and it's going to fill it in the wages array. It's basically going to fill the wages array. And so since I have the object here, I can call that method. So I'm going to call employee info dot, right, calculate wages. It doesn't need any argument. We didn't define it to accepting any argument. And so we just call it this way. And this, by just calling this, we've calculated the employee's wages. This is going to fill the employee array. I'll just close this a little bit, so I hope it's not confusing. All right, by doing this, we fill the employee, the wages array.